everybody here. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Electoral Area Services Committee meeting for September 18th. And first of all, I just wanted to mention, we just had a photo shoot a few minutes ago, that Cowichan Bay had won an award, a national award from planning on the Cowichan Bay charrette. So I wanted to share that with everyone. Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone that participated in it. It was a really wonderful event. I'd never done one before, and I think it was very valuable. So I just wanted to mention that and move on now to the acknowledgement that we are on the Coast Salish territory, as well as now an approval of the agenda. Actually, we have one new business item. So we have a closed new business item. It's employee relations, section 22. So that would be so moved. Is there a seconder? Thank you. All in favor? Any opposed? Motion is carried. Moving on now to the adoption of the minutes of September 4th, the Electoral Area Services Committee meeting of September 4th. Moved. Second. All in favor? Any opposed? Motion's carried. And now moving on, is there any business arising from the minutes?
Thank you, Madam Chair. There is none.
I'm going to go into the public input period. So is there anybody from the public that wishes to address the committee? Welcome, Mr. Evans.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, on the first thing in the agenda today is the information, and in particular, the South Cowichan Joint Advisory Planning Commission meeting. And if you look at that, these minutes are very, very short. Like, there's 2 paragraphs. And I happen to know that there was a delegation at that meeting that gave a delegation on aquifers and wells, and there's nothing mentioned in these minutes. I think that the APCs have been guided or coached to put out a brief minute report, but I think that if we have citizens coming in as a delegation to an APC and putting on a reasonable presentation, that they should at least be mentioned. And this brings me around again to the harmonization book that came out to the APC. I asked once before if it's possible to get a copy either for the community halls so that the public can look it over and have an idea what's in there. There's all sorts of rumors floating around the neighborhood, and really they don't know what they're talking about because they don't have the information. And so if they have the information, they'll be able to put some of their fears away and maybe put in some productive input into the harmonization. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. Is there anyone else that wishes to speak today?
Hi, my name is Chris Clay. I just wanted to speak very briefly about the cannabis retail policy that's going to be discussed later today.
Welcome, Chris.
Thanks. I lost my bifocal, so excuse me. So basically, I think the draft policy for cannabis retail is excellent overall. There was just one section that had a 300-meter buffer between water, industrial, and park zones that seems to cause a problem. I actually mapped them out for Shawnigan Lake, Cobble Hill, and Mill Bay. And there were, so in Shawnigan Lake, there's a water zone, there's LC Miles Park, there's a small park beside the post office, and if you go 300 meters from any of those, that wipes out cannabis retail for that community. Same thing in Cobble Hill, sorry. There's 5 P1 park zones scattered throughout the commercial area.
Maybe not get so close to the microphone.
Okay.
Sorry, it's just a little bit
Yeah,
feedback. There you
sorry
go.
about that.
Usually we have the opposite problem.
Is
Yeah.
that better?
Thank you. Much better.
Okay, and in Mill Bay, there's the Brentwood College parcel that wraps around the commercial area. There's a P1 park behind Pioneer Square Mall. There's another small park across the highway. And if you do the 300-meter buffer, it also eliminates cannabis retail from that area if we follow the guidelines. So I just wanted to read from an email from Mayor Al Sebring in North Cowichan, what they did. It was sent to Director Wilson, who kindly forwarded it on to me. Our policy briefly included specific distance requirements with respects to schools, playgrounds, etc., but we discovered that this was tying our hands in some of our small communities, such as Chemainus and Crofton, to the extent that we wouldn't be able to place dispensaries anywhere. So we did away with those specifics, inserting instead a general provision that Council will consider the impact of retail cannabis sales in proximity to public or independent elementary, middle, or secondary schools. And it goes on. It's just a general provision instead of specific distance requirements. And Ladysmith is doing the same thing, it sounds like. Yeah, the Ladysmith Chronicle the other day, an article said, Council was reluctant to set minimum distance requirements from parks and schools. Council prefers to treat cannabis stores like liquor stores, and Ladysmith's Liquor Depot is only steps away from Aggie Field. Retailers will be kept in specified areas and will not be operating near schools. So I'd just like to suggest that Section 2D, the location section of the policy, be replaced with Section 4.1 and 4.5 from North Cowichan. And if that isn't agreeable for any reason, I would just suggest that you strike these 7 words from that section that say, or a park, institutional, or water zone. If you remove those, it opens all this up, and this will be in line with the maps that we're going to see later today showing the permitted cannabis retail areas. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. Is there anyone else that wishes to address the committee? Welcome, Susan.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and fellow directors. I would like to also comment on the HOCP document. Having participated in the process, last night at the meeting, we heard from members of the delegation that there's still concerns about how much information has been shared with the public or not with the public. And there's also bringing that around to an item that was on the agenda last week about the lapover of areas in B and F in the area EOCP. And it was recommended that the matter be referred back, talking about those boundary adjustments. From last
electoral?
week's, yep, so it's still on the agenda today as being part of the minutes.
Just trying to follow along where it was.
Yeah. So in the referral, it was sent back to the steering committees for B, F, and E, but what was left out there, which is very important to the Area E and Area F community, it was not referred to the Satlam Local Area Plan Committee. And I think that hopefully was an oversight. The previous board, and I believe this board maybe, approved the authorization of that local area plan to help address some of the boundary conditions. And I think that those people that have put that time in should also have an opportunity to speak.
Thank you.
Thank you.
How much longer do we have on this? There's still more time. Come to the podium if you wish to address the committee on something that's on the agenda. Yes.
Hi, guys. My name is Jeff Anderson. I'm another local dispensary owner. I'm really glad to see that this is on the agenda today. It has been a little while coming. I was going to touch on the financial constraints, the length of this has put on small businesses in our community, but there's nothing that can be said or done now. At least it's on the agenda, and I really hope you guys can get this adopted so we can all essentially get back to work. I get approached by members of the community on just about a daily basis, complaining about how they've been forced back to the black market, and it's just surprising that we haven't had legal stores in the Cowichan Valley yet. And again, I'm just really happy to see this on the agenda, and I hope we can get this sorted out today. Thanks, guys.
Jeff. There's still a few minutes. Is there anyone else that wishes to address the committee? Seeing none, we'll move on. There is no delegations and no correspondence. Information.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Information items 1 and 2 are the Joint Electoral Areas A, B, and C Advisory Planning Commission minutes of September 5th, and the Electoral Area A Millbay Malahat Advisory Planning Commission minutes of September 5th, and they're for information.
Seeing no hands up and no questions, we'll move on to reports. R1.
Thank you, Madam Chair. R1 is a report from the Public Safety Division regarding the 2019 Community Emergency Preparedness Fund grant, and there is a recommendation.
Okay, welcome. Is there any questions for staff? Move the recommendation. It's been moved. Is there a seconder? It's been moved and seconded.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Restated for clarification, that it be recommended to the board that a grant application of $25,000 for each of Cowichan Valley Regional District 6 fire departments totaling $150,000 be submitted to the Union of BC Municipalities Community Emergency Preparedness Fund, Volunteer and Composite Fire Departments Equipment and Training.
It's been moved and seconded. Any questions, discussion? All in favor? Any opposed? Motion is carried. Moving on now to R2.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Item R2 is a report from the Water Management Division regarding the Shawnigan Beach Estates sewer system with regard to an exclusion. 3 properties are requesting exclusion from the service area, and there is a recommendation before.
Any questions from staff? Would you like staff to? Seeing none? Is there any engineering staff available? Seeing none. Were there questions for the engineering staff? Would you like us to move to R3 and come back? Yes, please. And come back to that. So we will hold that one and move to R3.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Item R3 is a report from the Development Services Division regarding policy for consideration of cannabis retail store applications, and there is a 2-part recommendation.
Welcome.
Good afternoon. So I'm here today to discuss, to present a draft policy which includes criteria for evaluating cannabis retail store applications with the purpose of informing recommendations to the Provincial Liquor and Cannabis Regulation Branch regarding cannabis retail license applications. So I just want to put forward that this is a presentation and discussion about cannabis retail only at this point, and I will bring cannabis production policy to the board at a later date. So this is cannabis retail only. So to go back to May 2018, in anticipation of the legalization of cannabis, the board adopted the following zoning bylaw amendments to include cannabis-related definitions, permitted zones for cannabis-related land uses, and permitted cannabis storefront retail in the following zones that are listed here. And I just want to go briefly over the provincial, federal, provincial, and local government roles in the legalization of cannabis. So cannabis was legalized by the federal government. The recreational cannabis was legalized on October 17th, 2018. The federal government establishes national frameworks for regulating cannabis cultivation and distribution. So their jurisdiction includes setting possession limits, licensing, establishing industry standards, and criminal enforcement. All production, processing, and associated sales operations must have a license by Health Canada. So in May 2019, so relatively recently, the federal government changed the regulations that say now that new applicants for federal licenses that for both retail and production now have to have a fully built facility prior to submitting their applications. And so this can present a risk that fully constructed facilities may not meet licensing requirements. In terms of the provincial role, so the province has the Cannabis Control and Licensing Act as well as the Cannabis Distribution Act, which establish a distribution system and retail licensing scheme for recreational cannabis. They also control the BC Liquor and Cannabis Regulation Branch, which we will refer to now in the presentation and in documents as the LCRB. And they're responsible for licensing and monitoring the private cannabis stores and as well as liquor stores. The province is not limiting the number of licenses in a community or establishing a maximum density through store separation distance which is currently applied to liquor stores right now. In terms of the local government role, so local governments can choose to not allow cannabis-related businesses in their communities. They can limit the number in a community and establish criteria for considering cannabis-related businesses, which is why we're here today. So local governments can regulate certain aspects, which include location, hours of operation, signage, the scale, density, as well as impose fees to recover the costs incurred in assessing these applications. This is the most effective way for local governments to influence where cannabis retail stores take place, which is through zoning and land use regulations. So before we get into the policy specifics, we have the regional district received two specific recommendations. One is from School District 79. So in March 2019, they sent a letter requesting that cannabis retail stores should be at least 600 meters from any school. And they would also like the opportunity to respond to referral requests for all cannabis retail store applications that will be considered by the board. And in September 2018, there was a letter to all regional districts, local governments, and First Nations from the medical health officers, which states that while they are in support of the legalization of cannabis, a balance between the benefits and harms must be achieved. And so their recommendation is to restrict public consumption of cannabis and exposure to environmental cannabis products by ways such as limiting where cannabis can be consumed and incorporating cannabis into smoking bylaws. Limit cannabis retail locations by imposing buffers and signage requirements, and limiting personal growth and small grow operations, as well as recommending that local governments be prepared to revise their location restrictions and limitations on cannabis when edible products, edible cannabis products become approved for sale, which is anticipated as October 17th of this year. So I would like to walk you through what happens when an applicant, a cannabis retail applicant, applies to the province. So they submit their application online to the LCRB, and the LCRB starts assessing the application for completeness and beginning their own security checks. The LCRB in this process also notifies the local government. And at this time, the local government has the choice to either make a recommendation or not make a recommendation. And so if we follow the orange column, so if the local government decides to not make a recommendation, the LCRB will not proceed any further and will not issue a license. On the other hand, if you follow down the green path, if the local government chooses to make a recommendation, it's responsible for gathering the views of the residents. So we'll talk about this a little further when I discuss the policy. However, the local government can choose to do this in several ways. They can receive written responses, conduct public hearings, hold referendums, or choose another method the local government considers appropriate. The local government's it's local government's responsibility to determine how the residents' views are gathered. There's no time limit in responding to the LCRB, but when the local government does choose to provide a response, it must be in writing. It has to show that the local government has considered the location of the proposed store. It has to include the views of the local government and the general impact on the community, include views of the residents and provide detail on how the feedback was gathered, and it has to include the local government recommendation. And so we have to clearly state if we approve, reject the application, or approve with conditions and the reason of which the recommendation is based. So if the local government does recommend approval, the LCRB will most likely go along with this recommendation. If they, however, the LCRB also holds the responsibility that they can choose to not issue the license even if the local government recommends approval. The board may delegate its powers and duties in license referrals to the license referral process to staff. And if the applicant doesn't agree with the recommendation, the applicant can request board reconsideration of the staff recommendation. So to get more specifically into the policy at this point, so yesterday, I believe, the agenda was amended to distribute a bunch of maps. I'm not going to go over each map individually because they get quite nitty-gritty down to the details of streets and things like that. However, the maps, the orange portions of the map show where we are proposing to allow cannabis retail locations, and the blue shows where it's already permitted, which is mostly in industrial zones. So the location criteria in the policy goes on to say that we are now recommending that to permit cannabis retail in zones that are already zoned for retail as a principal permitted use, or in previously approved zones, which would be the blue ones on the maps. We are proposing one per lot, not in residential buildings or residential properties, at least 300 meters from schools, parks, institutional water zones, playgrounds, licensed daycares, sports fields, community centers, or other areas where children and youth frequent, 300 meters from another retail cannabis store, whether it's active or not, and in areas already, oh, sorry, wrong line. So this is the table which is included in your report, so the orange is which shows where we are proposing in what zones, and the blue shows what's already permitted. In terms of the building and siting, we would recommend that when the applicant brings forward their proposed site, that the size of the retail store is consistent with the surrounding retail establishments. The design enhances or improves the area. It does not detract from it. There's discrete signage, and that parking and loading considerations are in place, which would go by our zoning bylaws. In terms of the application procedure, so the applicant would come in prior to submitting their application to the LCRB and come to staff to discuss a location. So pre-application with meeting would determine if the proposed area is suitable, and we would talk about the 300-meter buffers from areas and go over things like that. When the application is submitted, it needs to be a complete application. That includes being accompanied by a letter of preliminary acceptance from the LCRB. So that letter would be that first email where the LCRB says to the local government, we've received this application, we're notifying you, please respond. And our next response would be to the LCRB what our decision would be, whether it's to accept, reject, or accept with provisions. So they would submit a complete application, and then we would go on to conducting a public information meeting, and that would be the responsibility of the applicant, and the cost would be borne to the applicant, and they would conduct the information meeting and advertise to residents within 300 meters of the subject property. The CBRD would send out referrals that would include the school district, Island Health, RCMP, adjoining local governments if it's in closer proximity. And then we would, after we receive all the input, we would report to the board. The board would make a decision, and we would notify the LCRB. So I'm going to put forward the recommendation that the cannabis retail store policy be approved, and that staff prepare a report and draft zoning bylaw amendments to add cannabis retail as a principal permitted use to zones where retail is a principal permitted use, and to update cannabis-related definitions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Wright. I have Director Wilson, who has a question.
Well, I've got a couple of, I'd like the speaker, Mr. Clay, who was at the public input period, the document that he sent to all the members of the board actually has a lot of good points on there. And the biggest problem that I have with this particular report, and I have spoken to a couple of the planning people as well, is the 300-meter exclusion zone. And it's something which is going to put a huge amount of restrictions on basically just about every hub, village hub, retail hub within the South Cowichan area, and certainly within the CVRD. And I'd like to suggest that maybe the wording that North Cowichan has used, where it says council will consider the impact of retail cannabis sales in proximity. Basically, they haven't put a number here. I'd like to see a number taken out, and for what Mr. Clay has suggested in the document that he put forward, they're not unreasonable requests at all. If we can get this retail cannabis stores working, it's going to alleviate a lot of the problems that a lot of seniors have got right now. They have been basically cut off from a supply of CBD, and a lot of them need that CBD. If they've got the contacts, they've had to go to a black market or do without. Now, if they go to a black market, we all know what can happen. It may not be what they're looking for, and it certainly may not be the purest that they're getting. And I'd like to see the restrictions relaxed, so that we have discretion at this board when something comes forward. And
I think Mr. Tippett wanted.
yeah, so is there any chance that those restrictions could be relaxed so that we use some of the wording that perhaps has been suggested by Mr. Clay?
Yes, if you guys put forward a motion, it would be up to the board to decide what the restrictions are.
Okay.
So do you have an amendment to this current motion?
I do.
Mr. Tippett, would you?
Madam Chair, I don't have an amendment, but I do have a comment.
Yes,
Just
please.
for the information of the committee. Director Wilson's making a good point. However, it is true that any kind of setback, including a 300-meter setback for cannabis retail from certain specified uses, is something that can be varied with a variance permit. So it's true that it would create additional process. However, the intent is not, Shawnigan Village, for example, I think there's maybe about 0.1% of the village that actually permits retail that is beyond 300 meters of the park area there, the LC Miles. It's certainly possible for the board, in considering a license application and whether to support it or not, to at the same time simultaneously process a variance. So it's not sort of a regulation in that sense that's not able to be varied. However, it's also true that if that setback wasn't there, that the board still retains discretion under the current, and I do emphasize that because at the moment, at least, the province gives veto power to the local government over whether an application will proceed or not. And that could change. I'm not saying it is suggested anywhere that it would change. So they still would have complete discretion, even in the absence of these setbacks. So it's not sort of a drop-dead issue either way, but there certainly is a way to deal with it if the 300-meter thing stays in place. Just have a concurrent variance proceeding along with the license referral process.
Thank you. Looking at committee. Director Salmon, do you have a follow-up, Director Wilson?
If I could, please.
You follow up, and then Director Salmon. Yours microphone's on.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Tippett. And we did have a chat about this, and Mr. Tippett did bring this up to me, and it is a good point. It's just that it's an extra step, and I would much rather see us be in a situation where we don't have to take into consideration initially the 300 meters. I would much rather it comes to the board and the committee decides, yes, this is a good place, or no, it's not for various reasons, without the 300-meter restriction being there. It gives us a lot more discretion, and that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for to get things moving to help the local businesses and to help the local residents as well get what they need.
Thank you. Director Salmon.
Yeah, thank you. I agree that I think we could just, some wording that has discretion, that we consider proximity. And if I have this right, that it's sent as a referral to the school board in any case?
We can choose, the board would be able to choose who they refer to, however, they have explicitly asked to be referred to.
So I assume we would normally do that.
Yes.
To be double covered, we have the discretion, but also the school board has a voice. So I think if you want to make the motion, I would second.
There is currently a recommendation in your package, and if there's an amendment to that, or Director Kuhn, or is it Director Kuhn? No? Director Morrison.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and this would be through to staff. I'm not sure who would take this. So I'm wanting to understand the process here. So an applicant, prior to getting heavily involved, will come in and have an informal discussion with staff. There will be various steps taken, and we will have a policy that will guide staff on whether or not we should be approving applications that are sent to us. I'm assuming that if an application meets all of the requirements in the policy, that there will be an ability for our staff to be able to make preliminary approval of this application. Now, this is the clarification that I need. So if there's the ability for staff to be able to authorize the license to operate and to locate in an area, then does that authority exist within the general manager? And if it does, then the only ones that would be actually coming through to committee and the board would be those that are exceptions or that may not meet the requirements exactly. And those that are coming through, would they, as Mr. Tippett had said, have the ability to have that concurrent variance attached to it? We're going to be considering other factors. A variance to that 300 meters would be part of it. So is the staff able to firstly authorize the permit if they meet all the requirements, or is everything coming through to us?
Who is that for? Oh, Ms. Cheroff.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, subject to authorization by the board, the General Manager of Land Use Services or other staff person would have the delegated authority to be able to make a recommendation to the provincial licensing agency, to the LCRB, as to whether or not the license should be issued. And that would be based on consistency with the zoning and with the policy that you have implemented. And yes, if there is a situation where you have an applicant who does not have clear consistency with the policy that's brought forward, you also have the discretion to see those applications come before you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I have Director Acton.
Thank you, Madam
Back
Chair.
to-
I would like it to be clarified if schools are part of this discussion as well, because we've put in a 300-meter buffer zone for schools, and the school district has asked for 600, so I don't feel comfortable with that buffer zone eliminating elementary, middle school, and secondary schools when there's no proof here that that's a wise decision to make. So some clarity, I guess, on that, so that if we come down to changing the wording.
Director Nicholson.
In Cowichan Station and in Glenora, there are two small commercially zoned areas and we don't have, I don't think, the village capacity for that the community would be comfortable necessarily with a cannabis facility in those locations. So what you're proposing is either a blanket change all the Cs so that the cannabis is a permitted use, so there wouldn't be a community discussion about that if this was, apart from the public hearing for this particular change, I imagine. Or the option two is that there is a rezoning on a commercial, on a site-by-site basis. Is that, do I have that right?
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Director Haim.
Thank you. There's section 3 about the building and siting, separate from the distance side. There's a lot of shoulds in there. I don't know how that's going to be measured or how that's going to be determined. Item B, for example, should enhance or improve the aesthetics of the surrounding areas, not detract from them. So theoretically, because it's a should, it could be a case that it does detract, but it's still, for some reason, acceptable. Storefronts shall not include opaque window coverings. Vape stores are required to cover their windows. They can't show any sort of the inside product to the outside. The concern being children will be walking by and looking in. So that's kind of the reverse of the vape industry. And then there's the signage. Storefront shall not include signage in windows, and then there's C, signage should be discreet. So are you proposing basically just the signage on the building is the only signage related to these? I don't know how that works from an operational standpoint in kind of a commercial area. A lot of stores utilize their only signage could be on the windows.
Ms. Wright?
Yes, you're right. So it all should. So when an application comes forward, they would provide the design details, and at that point, staff would have the discretion to talk to someone. So, for instance, if the sign is overtly large, we could refer to the sign bylaw and say, you know, the sign needs to be brought down to this size, and you know, discuss what it will look like. If it's going to be completely out of character with the the existing retail in the location, we would want it to fit in and not be overtly what the store is selling.
Is that follow-up, Director Haim?
And in relation to that, though, some places there should and some places shall not. The shall not is pretty definite, as opposed to should include. You know, I'm willing to look at this and see how it works out in practice. But it's something that from an operational standpoint, I can see that causing some challenges for stores.
Right, and it does, it really just sets a higher standard for what the buildings and what the storefronts should look like. We're trying to really promote establishments that fit in with the community. So for instance, if it's in more of a village core, to fit in with the village core guideline or what the village core already looks like, but also just to make sure that staff are able to have the discretion when the applicant comes in to really help shape what it looks like. So it shall and shall not, or should not, but it can be taken, it is discretionary as well as to how we go about approving what a cannabis retail storefront is going to look like.
Okay, I have Director Wilson, Director Smith, and then Director Wilson. Director Smith hasn't spoken, so I'll go.
Through the chair to the staff, one of the things that I notice is it doesn't have Area G and Area H. We both are not under, we have areas that are not under School District 79. So was there any reach out to the other school districts so that Area G and H, we also have that comfort zone in there? That would be one of my questions.
So to answer that question, no, not explicitly. However, we would, when we do look at the zone or the proposed location, we would look to see if there's any schools, whether it be public schools with a school district or an independent school in the area, and refer to them.
So you'd refer to the other school district?
Yes.
Right, for those. One of the things I'm thinking is I like the 300 meters from quite a few things with a variance, because it seems like if we have a set distance, it creates a set so that it's not, oh, well, you're 100, oh, you're 20 meters. So it gives an absolute set number, and then a variance can be asked for. I like that part of that there is a definite number, as Director Haim pointed out, having words like shall and should. Definitely those can't be enforced when it says should. So there isn't any type of enforcement there. Or when it says should, it means that you can't enforce it. You can have them bring an application that should have those items in it, but if they bring a proposal to you, you cannot deny it because the word says should, right?
That's correct. However, we would lead them in the direction of hopefully improving the application.
So if an application is for a specific spot, does that application only apply to that one business? If they remove themselves at some point, would a different one have to come and apply through the same process?
Yes, they would, and they would also have a different retail establishment would also have to go through the LCRB process on their own. So every single time, even if it's in the same location, they would come back.
And I have
Follow-up, Director
follow-up.
Smith?
In Area G, we have some commercial zones, but they're like tourist, commercial, neighborhood pub. Are those types of zones going to be exempt from this process?
In the report, there is the table of all the zones, and if those zones aren't in there, it's because retail was not a principal permitted use. It could have been an accessory use in some zones. However, it was limited to only principal permitted use for retail, is where it was added.
Director Nicholson? Do you have another follow-up, Director Smith, after? Oh, okay. Director Nicholson?
Yeah,
And then I'm just waiting to get back to Director Wilson.
I'm just wondering about micro cultivation licenses, and I think they're allowed to do sales, and I'm wondering how that will work for on-farm retail.
I am going to bring a report forward for production, and I'm putting microcultivation within the production. So at this point, we're just not contemplating micro-production in this. And it hasn't really been looked at yet whether we would permit sales, but most likely not on an agricultural parcel.
So that'll come later.
So that will be a different, another discussion.
That's right.
But that, okay.
This is for retail. Director Smith, and then to Director Wilson.
Thank you very much. I'm not positive who can answer this question, but it sounds like we're going to have a lot of staff time involved in this, and there's a cost that will go with that staff time. And what type of fees are we looking at for collecting, and who will pay so that it isn't the taxpayer left paying for people applying for these applications? So is there someone who can tell us approximately what the cost is going to be and how we're going to be recouping that?
So in order for someone to apply to the CVRD right now, it is a $1,500 application fee. That's already in our fees and charges bylaw, and it says plus the cost of advertising. So that's that has already been taken care of.
Is this a follow-up, Director Smith?
Follow-up. So has anybody tracked the time that it would take to do one of these applications to see if it actually equals the 1,500? Or is staff time costing more, that will be costing more than that?
This will most likely, I'm going to defer to Mike Tippett on this one.
Mr.
With
Tippett.
your permission, Madam Chair, yes. We've already, maybe already, yes, but we have actually dealt with one of these applications in advance, like before we actually had the $1,500 fee in place, and it was for property on Allenby Road. That one was pretty light in terms of staff effort. We essentially got the referral from the province. We looked at the site. It was in a site that already had the appropriate zoning. We then were faced with the prospect, in the absence of the policy that Lauren's worked on here, of how do we engage with the community to give feedback to the province. And what we decided to do is we put an ad in the CVRD news section of the newspaper saying that on this property, with a little map, someone's applied for a cannabis retail license. If you have any comments, please contact staff. We didn't receive any comments, and so the matter went to the committee following that notification period and the board. And if I had to guess, I would say the total amount of staff effort into that probably amounted to under $500. The process proposed in this policy is somewhat more robust. There would be a public meeting that would be hosted and paid for by the applicant, but obviously CVRD staff would have to attend and so forth. And that was adjusted to $1,500 to try and recover some of those additional costs for time. So at the moment, we're fairly comfortable that we have it covered. However, we will monitor it. If it turns out that we're falling behind, I think Director Smith's point is well taken. We don't want to end up subsidizing applications.
Director Morrison, then Haim, and then back to Director Wilson. Oh, and Director Salmon.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'll be brief. Most of what I want to share is in a sense been covered. I think as Mr. Tippett has described, we've just recently revisited our fees, and I'm comfortable that that staff will ensure that we're recouping our costs with this. I'm also looking at the fact that we've got the request for a 600-meter exclusion zone from our school districts. We're talking about 300. There's been request and input from the community that be eliminated. I'm not so sure that that's necessary, given that that those that are going to be a little outside the norm or require a variance will come to us, and we can treat them accordingly, and I don't see an issue with that. So at this point, I'm comfortable. I think our staff have done a pretty good job. It's been a long time coming. I want to thank staff for their effort on this, and I'm quite comfortable with the recommended resolution in the report, and I won't move it because you've still got people on the list, but I would be prepared to if everyone else was comfortable in doing so.
Okay, I have a little bit of a speakers list, and I'll come back to you. I have Director Haim.
I just wanted to confirm, has this been moved?
No,
Okay, it showed on the live meeting part that it had been moved.
it's waiting.
When it comes to it, following up on what Director Smith said, that reference to School District 69, I'd like to see it changed to adding the wording, the relevant school district, as opposed to School District 69, therefore taking into account the more northerly section. But at this time, a motion hasn't been made with regards to the policy, so I'll leave that for now.
Director Salmon?
Thank you. Just a couple of things. One, I don't know if this would be an aside or if we could do anything about it, but the new federal regulation in last May about that it has to be fully constructed before they begin their application. And you say there's a risk then that fully constructed facilities might not meet the requirements. So just thinking that through, that would mean probably an applicant will want to find an existing retail space rather than building a new one. And if we're being very strict about the 300, any kind of location, then probably the option of building a new one isn't one that many people would want. So I'm just throwing that out there. I don't know if you have a comment or.
So what I've seen in a neighboring local government is that they constructed the store. The inside was built to the LCRB standard, and then they waited approximately a year for it to go through the municipal approval process. So that was really just the cost borne to the applicant. So at that time, they put in a lot of money and time into building a top-notch retail store. And if the local government had not approved of it, they could have been left with a fully standing retail establishment there meant to sell cannabis and cannabis-related products as of October of this year.
Follow-up, Director Salmon?
Thank you. So the other sort of separate one, back to the issue of whether we have discretion or a fixed 300 meters. One thing we've got is at schools and parks, I believe, we're park space as well. So just looking back at a case of Warmland in Melbay, I mean, the school property of Brentwood is close to the Pioneer Square where the applicant will be hoping to reopen. The Kelsey, we don't know, we're talking about from the school, from the lot line to the lot line, which these are some big properties, so that could throw off fixed. I think we are better with some discretion on that. Thank you.
I have Director Wilson, then Director Morrison, and Director Nicholson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As I've said, I did reach out to Mayor Sebring and Mayor Stone and to Mayor Staples and asked them what their situation was, and I think I'd like this board to consider learning from their experiences. And the words that Mayor Sebring said, our policy briefly included specific distance requirements with respect to schools, playgrounds, but we discovered that this was tying our hands in some of our small communities, such as Chemainus and Crofton, to the extent that we wouldn't be able to place dispensaries anywhere. So we did away with those specifics. Instead, inserting that general position that has already been read out. And Lady Smith said, Mayor, Stone said the same thing. Council was reluctant to set minimum distance requirements from parks and schools and prefers to treat cannabis stores like liquor stores. Ladysmith Liquor Depot is only steps away from Aggie Field. So I'm a little bit confused as to why we're treating the cannabis stores any different to what we're treating liquor stores. There's liquor stores very close to each other and very close to schools and playgrounds. And much as I'd like to see controls in place, I'm not sure why we're treating this any differently to the liquor stores. And I really would like to see the 300 meters either reduced or done away with.
Director Nicholson, then Director Morrison.
Yeah, I'm still hung up on my downtown Metro Couch and Station and Glenora, downtown Metro Glenora. So Couch and Station doesn't have any commercial activities currently, so it just seems to me that it would be very important to, would it be possible for these, those two sites to be removed from the overall zoning, if we move down to rezone?
I think I'm going to defer to my general manager on this one.
Yeah. Ms. Charoff.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So should the board choose to concur with the staff recommendation, staff would go away. There are two parts here. One is around the policy. The other is around drafting zoning bylaw amendments. So we would be bringing back to you proposed amendments to the various zoning bylaws across the region and electoral areas, that is. And within that, you'd have the discretion to be able to pick and choose which zones you'd wish to permit cannabis retail within. So if there are specific commercial zones that aren't sort of suitable for that type of use, then those certainly could be omitted from proposed zoning bylaw amendments.
Microphones, please, off. And Director Acton, then Director Morrison, sorry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'm prepared to move the recommendation, but I'd also like some clarity about the distance conversation that's going on. I hear the way that directors are talking, perhaps there's some misconception that if, for example, it's near a school, then the application will just be dismissed. My understanding is it would just come to the board and we would look at it as a variance, correct? So it's not preventing them from happening where the zone buffer kind of overlaps. Okay,
Correct.
that's
So are
totally
we-
how I
we're
understood it,
moving the
but I would
current
like to move the recommendation.
It's been moved and seconded. Okay. Oh, Director Morrison, still like to speak to it.
Well, yeah, and I, I've heard and listened to what our colleagues have said around the table, and I'm quite comfortable in moving this forward and hearing seeing what the staff bring forward. I don't think the 300 meters or 100 meters is a showstopper by any means. I think that what Director Wilson has said around our municipal partners is absolutely true, and that's partly why we have electoral area staff and an electoral area land use services department that's put forward their best professional advice for electoral areas, and that's what our land use responsibilities are for. So I don't see any difficulty with proceeding with this, and if there's a requirement that this is imposing too great a restriction on the ability of the industry to establish and open their doors, then we will revisit this. I don't see this as a challenge that we can't support this, so I will be voting in favor.
Okay, Director Acton.
Sorry, that's exactly what I was gonna say.
Okay,
If we can
I'm gonna-
first kick at the can here.
Okay, I'm going to turn to Ms. Harrison. Could you read the recommendation, please?
There's still.
Oh, still, sorry. Okay, there's still Director Haim and Director Nicholson.
I move to remove the reference to School District 69 in Part 1, 1E to the relevant school district.
Just a minute, you were amending, you have an amendment to the motion, and could you read your, again?
It is Part 1, let's make sure I get the reference here right. Part 1, Section 1, Item E. I move that we remove the reference to School District 79 and replace it with the wording, the relevant school district. because then that'll take into account the
Okay,
other
there's
aspects.
an amendment to, speaking to the amendment. No, nobody has moved, it's been moved and not seconded. Has it been it's been seconded. Okay, so there is an amendment to remove Director Morrison.
I'm pretty sure staff got the recommendation and they're gonna be following up on this, and the amendment actually isn't to the recommendation that's before us. So I'd urge that we defeat it, staff take this as direction and include it in the documents that are gonna be produced.
Thank you, Director Morrison. I'm going to call the question on the amendment. All in favor? Opposed? Oh, could you, if you're opposed, please hold up your hand so that we can clearly see. Okay, so the motion, the amendment carries. Director Wilson?
Yeah, I have an amendment as well, please.
Another amendment. Okay, so we need to, okay, go ahead. Could you have it written out for staff?
I don't, in fact.
Microphone, please.
Sorry.
What is your amendment, Director Wilson?
Would you mind if I just had a quick chat with Director? Yeah, I'd like to amend the motion by including option 1, which is in the document handed here, which is location. Replace section 4.1 from North Cowichan's policy, which the retail cannabis use must be located on or in close proximity to a provincial highway, urban arterial road, or urban collector road, and in commercial areas, including zones areas for retail use or designated for commercial use in the official community plan or local area plan, and add the section 4.5 from North Cowichan's policy, which council will consider the impact of retail cannabis sales in proximity to public or independent elementary, middle or secondary schools, playgrounds, libraries, public recreation centres, public community centres, parks, places of worship, family-orientated facilities, or areas where children and youth frequent. That basically removes the 300-yard restriction.
Whoa, did anybody get that amendment?
Yeah.
Oh, we have
need
that.
a seconder.
We need a seconder. Oh, it's been moved and seconded. On the amendment, discussion on the amendment. Yeah, Director Acton.
Well, that's a lot. You can't expect us to vote on that right now. Maybe we can come back and change that. Yeah, like, I can't even recite 2 sentences of what you just said. There was so much to it. Yeah, but
Director Acton,
it's not part, yeah.
is that a question?
I guess if people are interested in an amendment like that, I think it needs to be referred back, but I'm not gonna refer it.
Director Morrison? Okay, on the amendment, Director Nicholson?
Yeah, I think I agree that adding another layer we heard today that there's been a long wait for the retailers to get back in business, and I would really like to see this just move on and get happening, and I don't, while I know that they could jump through another variance process, I don't think that's necessarily in anyone's best interest, so I will be supporting the amendment.
On the second amendment, all in favor? Opposed?
Defeated.
It's defeated. So moving on to the main motion. As amended, actually. So, going to call the question. All in favor? Oh, certainly. Okay. Ms. Harrison.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Recommendation before you is that it be recommended to the board that the cannabis retail store policy as amended be approved, and that staff prepare a report and draft zoning bylaw amendments to add cannabis retail as a principal permitted use to zones where retail is a principal permitted use, and to update cannabis-related definitions.
Okay, all in favor? Opposed, if any? Motion is carried. Thank you very much. Moving back to our R2, and we have Mr. Dennison here. to speak to it. We had some questions on, possible questions for you on R2. So would you like?
Madam Chair,
Go
that's a
ahead.
new R2, is it? So I have it at R9 in my agenda. Or is it, it's been
No,
juggled
this
on its
is,
end?
we had questions on the Beach Estate sewer system.
Right, okay, so I guess
On
my
the
agenda's out
exclusion.
of date.
It's
Okay.
separate from that
All
one.
right.
So this is,
Thank you.
yes. Yeah, where are we? Okay.
So,
Yes,
yes,
please.
questions.
So we had questions, Director Morrison for Mr. Dennison.
Oh, sure, I'll kick it off. So I'm challenged with this, and I've seen a little bit of the discussion back and forth in that we've got the Innova report, correct?
Yes.
And I thought that there was fairly robust buy-in to a lot of the principles in that report, in that we've got so many of these small, very tenuous systems, and that we're going to try and move towards increasing the size and the robustness of these systems. So, you know, I look at the request that's before us, and I completely understand why the community members and the owners of these properties would like to not be part of the system. But I'm thinking this is very somewhat short-sighted, because in my view, and I could be wrong, but in my view, that these lots were created because there was they were fully serviced, and that was the notion. Now, the fact that an approving officer in Island Health allowed for standalone septic systems on these properties, when I thought the zoning included that they shall be hooked up to a system. So, given all of that, you know, I'm concerned that given we have systems that are new technology, they require a lot of attention and servicing, that if we allow for this exemption to happen, we're going to have these owners or the subsequent owners back at our door wanting to be part of the system and wanting to have the sewer. I think the fact that they were created with services there, and now to be excluded from that system, I think is short-sighted on our part. I think it goes against the Innova report about trying to condense and provide good quality services. So from your perspective, does this allowing properties out of systems, does it jive with what we've adopted as policy moving forward and implementing the Innova reports and its recommendations?
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a tricky one. We actually thought about this a lot, and it was a little hard to know which side to fall down on, and it is a matter of judgment, I think, very much so. Generally, that's true. I mean, if you're in a service area and you were joined as part of that service area originally and you change your mind down the road at some point, we don't normally recommend that they be excluded. So, you know, let's say an ordinary home in the middle of Shawnigan Beach Estates decides one day, no, I don't want to be part of this anymore. I want to have my own on-site system. I'm tired of paying the money or whatever. On a staff level, we would not normally recommend that, for sure. So in this case, there's a long history here. It goes back at least 13 or 14 years or maybe more. As far as we understand, we've had an updated information on the zoning, but as far as we understand, originally they needed to be part of the system to get their density, although now it's not the case. But the zoning bylaw and the OCP has been amended since this started. So I'm not sure about exactly the case at the time, but now that's not the case. So they are able to get the density with on-site servicing. So for some years, the original owner of the original parcel, met with us, had investigated options for servicing. It was always very, very expensive. It's quite difficult to do. It's an awkward location in terms of trying to provide a sewer service in front of it. So it was moribund for years and years and years. More than 10 years, it sat there without really anything happening. And then I understand that, I'm not quite sure, either the zoning changed so that he was able to do it with on-site servicing, or perhaps technically new technology permitted the on-site servicing, whereas it didn't before. Not quite clear about that, but in any event, they were able to go ahead and create the service. So the one thing that, from our point of view, and able to service the lots on-site and get their subdivision, that was what he was able to do recently. So the one thing that's a bit different for us in this case is that, so it was all part of the developer's work originally. It wasn't the lot owners that are there now. And the other thing is, it's still the case that if they ever wanted service, it's quite expensive for them to do, especially if one of them needed it and the others didn't. If they went in collectively, which would have been the cost originally to the developer, thereby shared among all 5 lots, then that would be more modest. But if it was done now by a single lot needing it, because perhaps a failed on-site system or something like that, it's a pretty onerous expense. So, you know, it's again judgment on, from our perspective, staff kind of thinking about this with, oh, well, yeah, there's some good arguments there. There's, of course, you're quite right about the NOVA report, and in general, we're always interested in expanding our service areas. For the sake of the service, of course, considering, you know, all the planning issues set aside for now, but for the service itself, it's always bigger, is always better for our, as far as reliability and sustainability financially. So anyway, there's the 2 sides of it.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you. Director Morrison, a follow-up.
And this may not be for Mr. Dennison, but perhaps to our general manager of land use services, or Mr. Carruthers. This was quite a surprise to me, because I thought that this would be proceeding with fully serviced lots. We're pursuing an approving officer, in-house approving officer authority. To me, this surprises because outside agencies have authorized these lots to be subdivided and go ahead. Would there be less likelihood of this surprise happening with in-house approving officer within these walls?
Ms. Cheryl?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So for clarity, the approving officer for subdivision would be independent, regardless of whether the approving officer is working through the province or in the future through the regional district. They have an independent authority, and they have the ability to evaluate subdivision on a case-by-case basis. Certainly, they are required by law to not approve subdivisions that do not comply with applicable zoning bylaws. So that is a kind of a clear condition. In this case, there was no density incentive that would have arisen through connection to sewer. So I would have to speculate, I'm not entirely familiar with the subdivision application, but I would speculate that the approving officer would have considered the need for appropriate servicing, whether that's through a community sewer system or through an on-site system. And in either case, if it can be proven that there can be effective treatment, then that would be suitable to the approving officer.
Director Haim.
One of my questions has been answered, but just for scope and scale, can you tell me approximately how big these lots are?
Is it not in our, is it in our?
We understand that to be half an acre.
Okay, thank you.
Quarter acre. Quarter acre, I don't know. I'm not sure.
Okay. Director Acton?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a really problematic one. I'm surprised that staff had a recommendation to approve it, but, and I know I feel for these landowners because they've bought into something that's possibly gonna cost them money. And so I'm trying to understand, so obviously the developer was able to go around the regulation somehow. Is there, so now they're a brand new lot, brand new houses. I actually walk by it quite often. And they have a new on-site septic system. Obviously, it's probably working pretty good. Is there a way that we could kind of defer it only for 10 years, say? Because this is really, this kind of thing really hurts the community. It's $30,000 that's not spent because they've just paid $30,000 each per one that could have been spent tapping into the system eventually and keeping it running well and keeping our groundwater safe. And so in 25 years when this is failing, or 20 or whatever, it's not necessarily that they won't necessarily hook in, say. They may not even know they have problems. So is there a way that we could only approve it for, say, 10 years? Or, it's a little bit unfortunate too that now there's, the whole community is gonna pay for this, but
Madam
I'm
Chair, to
trying
my
to-
knowledge, I don't know that there's a way to do that. Perhaps Kathleen might
I
comment.
thought maybe
but
that might be a
it's
solution.
not as far as, we don't have.
Apparently, it's not a solution.
Yeah, I don't think you'd have that a sunset, in an approval, I don't, like, once they're excluded, there's not a sunset clause that forces them back in.
Is there a way through billing that we give a discount? Because it was something like almost $1,000 a year that they're paying now just to be part of the system that they're not even a part of, so.
Madam Chair, I think, again, Kathleen could comment, but I think we can switch off a parcel tax. So it's possible to retain a property within the service area and toggle off, if you will, their payment of parcel tax. But I don't know the whole procedure for that. I do know, for example, in Yubo, we created a debt service area, and some of the property owners we allowed to prepay their debt all at once. And so they paid, but they're still in the service area, but we just switched off their payment of parcel tax to pay that debt. The other properties that didn't have that are paying every year and will be paying it off over 20 years. So I know that's possible there. I don't know otherwise what precisely the procedure might be.
Follow up, Director Acton?
Thank you. And I think if the committee was willing to look at if staff could somehow come back with maybe giving this some other thought of how can we kind of make this a little easier on these landowners, because I do feel for them and they have been, somehow they're in a bad situation that's not to their own fault, and I'd like to be able to help them if we can.
We can look into that, Madam Chair, for
Would
sure.
someone second and refer that back? Thank you.
It's a motion to refer and on the referral. Director Nicholson on the referral.
I just think when you're looking at it, it would be useful to have sort of a time-bounded, I like that idea, I thought that was really smart.
Director Smith on the referral.
So when it's referred back, I see that B and E are not part of this exclusion. So when it's referred back, will they be included? Because what will happen to them?
They didn't apply, so we informed them and they didn't submit for exclusion.
So we have three
I guess we would
going-
inform them, Madam Chair, probably the easiest thing is we'll just let them know what's going on and if they wish to pursue that. I would imagine they wanted to stay in the service area and were willing to pay the money because they wanted that option available to them in future. One of the lots also is not built on, and so maybe that one still wants to have that open, I'm not sure. So we'll inform them of the process.
I think that final lot's too small, maybe, to
Could be.
it has to hook up.
Yeah.
Okay, motion on referral. I'm going to call the question. All in favor? Any opposed? Motion is carried. Thank you very much, Mr. Dennison. Moving on now to R4.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Item number R4 is a report from Inspection Enforcement Division regarding the August 2019 Building Inspection Report for information.
This is for information. Are there any questions? Seeing none. Oh, Director Nicholson. Who do you have a question for?
Staff,
Mr. McDonald?
whoever can answer.
Okay.
So we get these reports regularly, and I'm wondering about the correlation between building permits and land use applications. And when I look at the building permits, it looks like we're in a cooling off period. We're not seeing as many building permits, if I'm looking at your chart correctly, over the last 2 years, I guess, 3 years.
Through you, Madam Chair. I was looking over August alone, and August is actually the third best in 10 years, with 2016 and 2017 the only years beating that. I have looked to see what was in the queue. We have approximately 30 plus permits sitting with planning, so beyond that, I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Follow up, Director Nicholson?
Yeah, I'm just trying to load this thing up. So when I look at new housing starts, and I look at the, I'm sorry, my thing's not working. Okay, forget it. So when I look at total building permits issued, it seems lower this year than last year and the year before. And I'm just wondering if, you know, this 1 month may be higher, but in general, are you seeing sort of a slight cooling off period?
What we see typically is it's a cycle that happens quite often. And what I was looking at was even to date for 2019, that typically over 10 years, what I noticed was that we're so far 312 this year. The average over 10 years at this point would be 302. So we're actually even ahead of the average of 10 years. So we're probably coming down the backside of a wave, but we're still doing, permits themselves are still very strong.
Okay, so what I'm really wondering about is the relationship between building permits and land use applications. And if, because we're on a downswing, is that helping address the backlog, or where are we at with the backlog?
Ms. Cheroff?
Madam Chair, so staff have been asked to report back to the Electoral Area Services Committee prior to November regarding the volume of files in land use services, and we'll do so by that time as directed.
Director Nicholson?
So can you comment on the relationship between building permits and land use applications?
Madam Chair, staff are not prepared to comment on the relationship between development and building permit applications at this time, as we haven't completed a thorough analysis to be able to give you accurate information.
Director Nicholson?
So the
follow-up?
So the report that's coming will show that kind of information? Because I just think that in general, we haven't been looking at the land use applications. We haven't been getting reports like I appreciate these building reports, and we get enforcement reports, but we don't get land use application reports. And I'm just thinking that it would be kind of nice to, and particularly if we get these building reports, if they tie together, to see it all together, that's all.
That will be coming.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, so we certainly will endeavor to provide you with the information that you're requesting, and I think this could also sort of form part of the discussions that you have around your strategic planning for the committee.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, that was for information. Seeing no other hands up, thank you very much, Mr. McDonald. We'll move on to R5, and welcome Mr. Munn.
Would you like me to introduce?
Yes, please do.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Item R5 is a report from Development Services Division regarding development variance permit application DVP 19102 for 9814 Miracle Way. There are two options in the report. Staff are recommending option 1.
Mr. Munn. Oh, Director Kuhn.
I'm ready for a motion.
Okay, go ahead. It's been moved. Any discussion, any questions to staff? Seeing none, all in favor? Any opposed? Motion is carried. Thank you very much. Moving on to R6.
Thank you, Madam Chair. R6 is a report from Development Services Division regarding development permit application number DP 18D15 to amend phases 1 and 2 for 5301 Chester Road. And there are two options. Staff are recommending option 1.
Welcome, Ms. Began.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Director Wilson? Well, she's moving the recommendation. Is there a seconder? Seeing no seconder for the recommendation yet. This is Chester Road. It's moved and seconded. Would you like anything from staff? Any presentation? Seeing? Okay, we'll just wait a second. Thank you, Ms. Began. Go ahead, Ms. Began, and then it's been moved and seconded, but we'll just, I'm not seeing.
So the subject property is located in Electoral Area D. It is currently a business commercial site, 5301 Chester Road. So this application has come forward to amend Phase 1 and Phase 2 of development permits that were issued in 2012 and 2015. This is Phase 1 in red and Phase 2 in blue. The proposed amendments include reducing the ALR landscape buffer from 9 meters to 6 meters to accommodate a gravel pathway behind the buildings, as well as relocate garbage and recycling receptacles. The rationale for these amendments is one, to meet provincial health regulations for one of the current businesses that are operating at one of the buildings, as well as provide an unobstructed exit route as there's exit doors, but they were backing directly onto the landscaping. During a site visit that staff conducted, we noticed a number of issues. Those included development permit conditions that were never met, both from the 2012 and 2015 development permits that were issued for the site. So staff worked with the applicant to address a number of these that are listed in your staff report. The applicant agreed, and so now staff are recommending approval of this development amendment to Phase 1 and Phase 2. And I can take any questions that may arise.
Been
Thank you.
moved and seconded. Would you like to read out the recommendation?
Thank you, Madam Chair. The recommendation before you is that it be recommended to the board that development permit number DP 18D15 for 5301 Chester Road be approved.
Thank you. I still had questions. Sorry, I had Director Morrison and Director Nicholson. I didn't see your hands before I.
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair, and I think I'm prepared to support this recommended resolution. I just want to be sure that staff have a high degree of confidence that the deficiencies that were noted in your visits are going to be addressed with this resolution being approved by the board, that you have a high degree of confidence that the applicant will make good on commitments.
I can't
Ms.
speak
Began?
to that confidence.
Director Nicholson.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that comment.
She can't speak to that confidence is the
I'm
answer.
wondering, do we have a process for standard follow-ups on when we issued permits?
Who could answer that from staff? Do we-
Given our workload, very rarely do we follow up. We follow up on landscaping. So for example, in this case for Phase 2, it was approved in 2015 and landscaping has yet to be completed. It worked out that they're amending it, so they don't have to rip out landscaping, but due to workload, we normally don't follow up. And in regards to actually ensuring that the conditions are met, from my understanding, the only way to do it is to go through an injunction for the courts. And I can be corrected by the GM.
Ms. Cheroff.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So as part of the process of issuing development permit, there is an existing landscape security that's on file, and my understanding is that would be replaced by new landscaping security that we would hold and would retain until such time as required landscaping and works are completed. Once those are completed, the security can be returned. If the works are not completed within the allotted time, within a reasonable amount of time, then the CVRD does have the ability to go in and complete the works.
Thank you.
I would
Ms.
just like to
Began.
clarify, though, that's just regarding landscaping. There's parking issues here, there's issues around where the garbage is located, so it goes beyond just landscaping, and that's what we don't have a bond for, so.
Thank you. Director Nicholson.
Should we be looking at changing that, or is that possible?
Ms. Cheroff.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So concerns around that are not related to landscaping per se, that might be related to potential violations or existing violations of zoning could be processed separately through our bylaw enforcement staff. That would be the correct route to do that type of thing. For violations of the zoning bylaw, there is the ability to apply ticketing. If there are violations of development permit guidelines, as Planner Bejan has noted, that would require a court injunction. But certainly, I think the majority of the things that we're talking about are actually things that are within the zoning bylaw.
All right. Call the question. All in favor? Opposed, if any? Motion is carried. Moving on now to R7.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Item R7 is a report from Development Services Division regarding development permit application number DP 18E07 for 6129 and 6140, 6146 Payne Road. Staff report contains two options, and staff are recommending option 1.
Go ahead.
For the
Ms.
presentation.
Megan.
Okay. Subject property is located in Area E. It's quite a large parcel, includes 2 parcels at the moment, and the proposal is, my apologies, there's a subject property map. You can see the triangle is Lot 1, the remainder is the parent parcel. So the proposal is to do a lot boundary adjustment as well as create a subdivision of a 2-hectare lot. The subject parcels are within the riparian area regulations development permit area, as well as the wetland development permit area. A basic RAR assessment was completed for the site. It identified fish-bearing streams as well as wetlands on the parent parcel, as well as 3 wetlands that were isolated that were not subject to RAR. The recommendation in the RAR assessment report was that when construction was proposed, which it is not at the time, be it for the road or for any buildings, that a 10-meter buffer be placed around the isolated wetlands, and as well as fencing and sediment erosion control measures. Staff have also asked that the road be realigned as the original proposal conflicted with the buffer of one of the wetlands. And so staff recommend approval of the DP application subject to the requirements listed in the DP. Thank you.
Thank you. Turning to the director of the area.
I have a question.
Okay.
This will create a split zone, will it not?
That is correct.
Yeah, what are the implications for a future development with split zones?
So staff did assess that. Given the size of the parcels, we don't believe there'd be any implication, and we have asked community planning to amend the mapping in the future so that it aligns appropriately.
I'll move the recommendation.
It's been moved. Is there a seconder? It's been moved and seconded. Any more questions? Seeing none, I'll call it. All in favor? Any opposed? Motion is carried. That will go to what board? I forgot to mention that through this. October 9th board. Thank you. And we'll move on now to R8.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Item R8 is a report from Development Service Division regarding zoning application number RZ 18104, Woodland Shores, Lot 66, Area I. And there is a 4-part recommendation before you.
Thank you. I turn to the director of the area.
Yeah, I have a motion. I would like to move to staff recommendation option 1.
Okay. Is that what we had on?
Sorry.
Mr. Tippett, maybe you could.
Madam Chair, it caught me off guard. I didn't
Yeah,
expect
sorry.
to leap ahead to this. Sorry. Okay, here it comes.
It's going to be. Okay, thank you. Okay, so that is option 1, and was there a seconder? I don't think I saw a seconder. Oh, it's been seconded. Yeah, it's been moved and seconded, and Director Acton.
Can you explain the role that the APC would play in an application like this? If it was referred to an application like this would normally be referred to the APC?
Mr. Tippett.
So,
Madam Chair,
there's no APC, so is
Well-
there another way for us to get some public input then without going to public hearing?
Madam Chair, if I may, the reason staff brought this straight to the committee is the nature of this rezoning and the one that follow is that they're extremely, well, not necessarily simple, but straightforward in the sense that it's not a radical change to a development that was approved 10 years ago. It's simply adjusting zoning, in this particular case, only to permit bare land strata instead of building strata. So yes, in principle, an APC would provide input on any land use matter that's referred to them. In this case, the importance of that input is probably limited just because of the very simple and limited nature of the proposed zoning change.
Director Nicholson.
Thank you. I had the same questions because there's no hearing, no APC, no referrals, just a public notice. And I am concerned about public transparency when we go down, when we do this kind of thing. And if I lived in this Woodland Shores, I think at least a public meeting so that people understand what is being proposed, and if they have any concerns, we hear about them. Otherwise, we're sort of bypassing the community completely, and I'm not comfortable with that.
Director Morrison.
Yeah, let Director Kuhn take that one. I guess the question that I have is about the nature of the strata, and is there a potential that by going to bare land that there may be a proliferation of short-term rentals, Airbnb, that sort of thing in a property like this? Given that I thought we were looking at a multi-unit residential, at least potential for that there. Now we're looking at going to a bare land strata. I can see this turning into a recreation rental area as a result of this change. Do you have any comment on that?
Mr. Tippett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is the proponents in the audience, and if he wishes to chip in, he might wish to. But I think the intent, as stated to us by the applicant, is that by going to a bare land strata, it's more likely to appeal to families and full-time residents than the other development scenario they had there. In both cases, the land use within the strata area would be subject to strata bylaws, and the strata would be within their rights to develop rules to interdict short-term rentals. And the proponent certainly isn't asking for short-term rentals in this particular application. The next one, there is an element of that, and we can get to that in a minute, but not in this one. So in my opinion, it wouldn't make any difference. In fact, it might even be the opposite effect.
Director Kuhn.
As far as I'm concerned, the proposal is actually a benefit to the area because the bare land strata will encourage different buildings. It will not be a building scheme like the two previous developments where the units were built all the same, and I've heard complaints about that from some of the residents that say, well, it would have been nice if there had been some variance, and this will encourage that. So I'm very much in favor of it, and I'm quite sure that the people are in favor of that too.
Director Morrison.
Yeah, thank you. And in regards to the item 4 in this recommendation, my understanding of the community's level of understanding of what is being developed there is quite high. I as Mr. Tippett characterized this as a sort of a reallocation and just a change that these two applications are not going to cause great concern by people in the community, and I just looked to the fact that we're all anticipating there be a report from our general manager of land use services on backlogs and the likes, and one of the things that we can do by when staff are recommending a streamlined way to address items, and let's face it, public meetings and public hearings take a lot of staff, take a lot of time, and add time to the process. I think this is more than fair that we proceed and support this, and I will. Thank you.
Director Nicholson, Acton, and back to Director Kuhn. Oh, and Wilson.
Thank you. You haven't convinced me. I really, this first application, whatever number we're on, 8, looks pretty straightforward. But then when I read R9, I thought there's two changes that are happening in this area. And I think the residents really deserve to understand what's going on before it happens, so that if there are any issues, we hear about them. And So I would like to amend this. And I'm not, my issue is I'm not sure that we actually need a whole full-blown public hearing, but certainly a public meeting, I think, is in order.
Do you have an amendment, Director Nicholson?
Well, my question, first of all, is a public meeting, it seems to me, would come before these three things. Would it not?
Sometimes, yes, Ms. Charoff.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just for the information of the committee, if a local government decides to waive the holding of a public hearing, it is still required to give notice the same way that you would if you were to conduct a public hearing. And the notice describes the purpose of the bylaw, the lands that are the subject of the bylaw, and when and where the bylaw can be inspected. So there's an opportunity for those that may be affected by the bylaw change to gather information about it and also to provide input. And the board may receive information about the bylaw and any supporting information from community members up until such time as it chooses whether or not to adopt the bylaw. And that's a little bit different than your rules under public hearings. So in some regards, it's much more flexible. And there's still, as I said, a need and a requirement to notify the public. So it's not that the proposed waiver would be sliding something under the rug, so to speak.
Yes, okay. I have Director Kuhn. You have a
Can I-
follow-up after?
yes.
Okay, Director Nicholson, then Director Kuhn.
Well, I would just like to amend it so that it says a public notice and meeting. I'd like to amend it so that number 3 says a public notice and meeting occur in its place.
Point of order, Madam Chair. I believe Director Nicholson is looking at report 9, and we're on report 8.
Thank you. Okay, we'll go to Director Kuhn.
Yeah, we shouldn't,
You're on 8.
we
We're
should
on
not bunch
R8.
up the two applications together.
Okay, Director Kuhn, would you like to speak to it? Go ahead.
Yeah,
I
Did
mean, you'd
anyone
like to
second it?
these are two different applications, and there'll be a separate motion on the second application, and it'll be a different motion. So we shouldn't bunch them up in one. That's not fair. We are just dealing with that one application, and that's a very minor amendment, actually. So I don't see any need to have a public meeting or public hearing for that first application. We'll deal with the second application afterwards.
Director Acton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I agree with Director Nicholson in the sense where, like, how is the public finding out here? How there's no APC. Are we going to send out, and she's trying to add some way for the public to find out that's a little better than our weak ad in the Citizen. Like, that is, yes, we're following the rules, but is there some other thing that we could do, like have a buffer zone, or where we send direct mail to a certain distance around that the application, or just something,
Mr.
or
Tippett.
send it to Area F APC. Surely Area F's APC cares just as much
Mr.
about
Tippett.
UBO as Area I does, so they can. Well, if you
Mr.
don't
Tippett,
have one,
excuse me, let's go to staff who would like to respond.
I'd like to respond to the first sentiment. The process for public notice requires notification in every respect, so our 60 meter, yes, notification radius, et cetera, applies. Because this particular rezoning would only affect one parcel, it's not 10 or more owned by 10 or more people, we still have to send out notification letters just as though we were having a hearing. In the event that we receive a bunch of comments from people who are so notified that, wow, I'm horrified that there's not going to be a hearing or a meeting or whatever, staff will certainly bring it to the attention of the board before adoption is considered.
So there is notification and communication. Director Kuhn, and then Director Wilson.
Yeah, I would like to make one more comment. You might recall,
Director Nicholson, could you turn off your
in-
microphone, please?
in a previous board meeting, I was quite upset about the delay in the planning department, and that applications have been lying there with not being processed. This is the one I was referring to. This thing has been sitting in the planning department for a whole year. and that's one of the reasons why I'd like to just process it. This is, to delay now even further, that's unacceptable as far as I'm concerned. This thing has been sitting there for a year. All they received was one phone call from the planning department. And to me, it was disgusting. And I only heard about it when the applicant sent me an email asking me if I could help. And so there we are.
Director Wilson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm quite astounded at the amount of nitpicking that's going on about this one particular thing here. It's pretty simple, and I'm going to read out the background. One sentence there, which says this is approved a decade ago, and the CVRD also receives 72% of the land base as an amenity, which is now Bald Mountain Park. What more do you want from this person? Let it go ahead. There is nothing wrong here.
Okay, I'm going to call the question on the option 1 is what we had moved and seconded. All in favor? Opposed, if any? Motion is carried. That will go to the October 9th board. And moving on now to R9.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Item R9 is a report from the Development Services Division regarding rezoning application number RZ 18 I-05, and that's Woodland Shores Lot A, Lot 64, and Lot 67, Area A. There are 3 options in the staff report. Staff are recommending option number 1.
I'll turn to the director of the area, Director Kuhn.
Yes, I would like to make a motion to refer this application back to staff. And the reason is that we haven't quite finished the discussions about the possible amenities. Because this application was one of the ones that has been sitting there for so long, we tried to expedite it, and we started to realize that there was a little bit more discussion to be had, and so that's what I would like to
Referral, is there a
encourage.
seconder?
Yes.
It's been referred back. Sorry, Director Morrison? Oh, sorry, I missed your.
Madam Chair, I just was going to ask for your permission to run through the presentation.
Absolutely. Okay, go ahead.
Because it's a bit more complicated than the
Yes,
last
thank
one, and my report
Yeah.
was really, really brief, almost to the incomprehension, so apologies for that. So anyway, it's in the same general vicinity as the other sites, Woodland Shores Development. I just want to point something else on the title sheet. I don't know, I think when I did this PowerPoint, it said Lot 67 and Lot A. Somehow 64 crept into it again. Lot 64 in this development is not part of the subject property, just to be clear. So the subject property is shown on the map here. It's the gray shaded ones. The 2 pieces that are separated by the narrow road there, Marble Bay Road, are Lot A, and then the one that says 67 is obviously Lot 67. This just kind of shows where they are. There are elements of waterfront to both of the parcels. Essentially, there's a very minor adjustment downward in density that would result from the possible approval of this application. So Lot 67, which is the most eastern of the lots, it's in the LR10 zone. It would go from a permitted 36 lots with today's zoning down to 5 lots. And the proposal says that 31 of the lots, in other words, the ones that aren't used on Lot 67, would go to Lot A. So Lot A is those 2 pieces that are straddling Marble Bay Road. So the portion below Marble Bay Road is in 2 zones, LR9 and RM8. Together they permit about 30 units now. And the portion of Lot A above Marble Bay Road, which is just below the water tower, if you know the property, permits 60 units now. So therefore, if this proposed rezoning was approved, it would add 60 to 30 to 31. So on Lot A, which is those 2 elements that, again, reach across Marble Bay Road, the total would be 121 units presently permitted. The applicants asked for 118, not 121, so that's actually the minor reduction in density. So Lot A, if this proposal were to go ahead, would be put into a new zone which permits 118 units on the entirety of Lot A with a fairly wide flexibility in built form between single-family, two-family dwellings, and multifamily. And right now, the zoning kind of mixes all those uses up anyway. This would just allow it to be moved about the site as is appropriate. And also, they wanted to have up to 25% of these units available for short-term rental, which is something that we've actually done in an adjacent subdivision in a special zone there. That's called Cottages at Marble Bay, if you're wondering. So it's more complex than the last one. We still believe that the application has sufficient merit to proceed to bylaw stage, and then the recommendation is here. Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to.
Thank you. I have a question on
Sure.
the 20, I'm always interested in the short-term rentals. I didn't, the cottages have a 25% of the cottages can do short-term rentals currently?
Madam Chair, the term cottages is in relation to the adjacent subdivision that's further east. It's called Cottages at Marble Bay. There was a rezoning done there a couple of years ago, or probably more than that now, where a combination of short-term rental and full-time residential use was permitted. And so I was just saying that in this proposed new zone that would apply to Lot A, this applicant has asked for about 25 or up to 25% of the units in that development being available for short-term rental. I presume that would be managed by the stratas that are.
Yeah, that was my next question. Who manages the 25%?
Maybe we should get the applicant to come up.
Oh, sure. Would you like to step forward? Thank you. Welcome.
I'm not that tall. Wayne Hopkins from Cowichan Lake Holdings. First, I just want to make one quick comment that every application that you get before you, including the last one and this one, they actually start with communication with the residents of Woodland Shores. We're a fairly small development in the overall scheme of CVRD, and as Director Morrison is correct, they're very informed of everything. In fact, the last application you just dealt with, the change came from the residents across the street that wanted to see single family maintained as opposed to a larger massing multifamily. In relation to this application, this once again came forward because of concerns about having 36 multifamily units right on the lake, when right now you have relatively large lot, single family on the lake. So we started looking at that, making that change, and decided, well, let's take that density and shift it to what is we consider Lot A. In our minds, it's still Lot 68. The decision to add in short-term rental was partially we haven't allowed it with any other development, and for the most part, the stratas are doing a great job enforcing that, and the residents are doing a great job respecting that. There's always a couple that try it, the other residents find out, and the strata usually squashes it pretty quickly. We figured that if there was places where it could be legally done, it might help eliminate other people trying to do it. I just want to speak quickly to Director Kuhn's motion. One of the things when we spoke prior to the meeting today, we realized that there's not many people around this table or in staff that were around 10 or 12 years ago when we did the application and went through the entire process to create Woodland Shores. So in answering some questions, we realized that maybe a little bit of background in education would be helpful for the committee when they're dealing with this particular one, just to make sure that there's no misunderstandings or incorrect information that's being thrown into it. And I could already tell that there was maybe a little bit of lack of background.
Thank you. Okay. So there is a motion on the floor to refer back to staff. So all in favor? Opposed, if any? Motion is carried. Thank you so much. Moving on now to, where am I? R10.
Item R9, unfinished
Nine.
business.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. There is
I
none.
just want to move faster than. Okay.
And there is no new business.
There is no new business.
And then question period.
Question period. Is there anyone in the gallery that wishes to ask a question to the chair? questioners are not permitted to make a speech. I just like to say that. Welcome, Mr. Evans.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I see that the Meadowview subdivision was referred, and what I would like to see is when this is referred, would you look at this very, very closely, because this was a riparian area where a house was being flooded out, and I'm in favor of what Director Morrison said, that he thinks that that the sewer and water system trying to connect everyone is on the table. And I went to the meeting last night, and it just seems anti-productive to hook up a riparian area to septic tanks when we have the facilities right there. This riparian area drains through a series of small streams right into Shawnigan Creek.
Thank you. I'm sure it'll be looked at.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Is there anyone else that wishes to ask a question to the chair?
Thank you, Madam Chair. A reoccurring theme that was coming up today was the rights, or the expectation, maybe the expectation is a better word than rights, for the public to first be informed, to be able to participate, and have a voice. And when we move away from that process, is the public being let out of the process?
Actually, what I heard from staff is that they were added into it, actually. So I see that there was actually more flexibility when we talked about the public hearing process as opposed to public meeting, and they would be sent letters.
In some of it, but I also heard when you move into delegation of authority, then that step can be taken out. The public process part of it can be taken out.
I didn't quite hear that there was any process that was taken out myself, so I don't know. You could double check with staff, but I felt that that was covered.
The other thing we heard today was a lack of information contained within some of the APC minutes. And there have some that have been pulled and not brought back to this table. Can we have a clarification when that will happen, when those minutes will be put back?
Actually, my understanding, but you could check with staff, is that some of the applications that are coming from APCs goes well beyond what they're being requested. So that is a challenge because they are not the elected bodies and they are not the professional staff. So we are seeing a lot of that, and there's a format to go through. So there's a balance between the community input, professional staff, and the elected official, and I think we're trying to make that, and we're trying to meet those expectations.
Thank you for that, Madam Chair, but I don't believe you answered my question that those APC minutes that have been previously pulled, when can the public expect to see them back on the table for approval?
I don't know what minutes have been pulled, but you could check with staff on that because I'm not aware of minutes that have been pulled.
So the public is now being asked to be accountable or to make sure things are being done?
I'm sure things are being done.
Thank you.
Is there any more? Okay, I motion to go into closed. Moved, second, all in favor? Any opposed? Motion's carried. We take 5 minutes.